So that's crisis and emergency accommodation. Now, in terms of homeless, there is the way that has now been pioneered in a number of countries overseas. Finland was one of the first to adopt this. It's called housing first. Housing first. And what they do there is dignity. For a homeless person, you're given housing with a kitchen, an ensuite, a lockable door that you only live in. It's not double shared. And you are wrapped with services and support to get you back on your feet and back into society. This thing has been brilliant. I mean, in just a number of years, Finland reduced their homeless by about 50%. And it's a lovely coloured graph. They got all the different categories of homeless, and you just see this graph coming down, and then there's a certain core that you will never reduce, which you're sort of getting down close to. Some of the crisis accommodation providers in Victoria have recently been announcing projects. Now, these crisis people are usually also, by the way, branched into community housing since their start 20 years ago. So, you know, I'm adding them into that category, but they've been getting into this housing first area, or I'll call it market, and I suspect they're after the money that can be made from providing services. Now, there is a lot of charitable and good-hearted support behind this. I've seen a couple of press announcements. The City of Melbourne has donated buildings to providers. Philanthropists have given money. The government has given subsidies. The idea is right. Everyone does get their own bedroom and all those sort of things, and they do talk about services. So I really wish those organisations well. I'd be much more comfortable if it was the government running it with a welfare objective. Some of them sound very good. They're even on the news. Accommodation for women escaping violence down in Dandenong, 60 ladies, 160 kids in a place there in Dandenong Central. So a lot of stuff coming out of that crisis and accommodation space. But I'm wary because it's the community housing providers who are providing the stuff. And oh, by the way, and we do know there's a bucket load of government money going in there, because this is the ex-homeless people that were housed in hotel rooms. Remember that during COVID? So halfway through that, or when it looked like coming to an end, the Andrews government did announce a bucket load of money to be given to a couple of the crisis accommodation providers to do what we're now seeing the announcements around. That's probably me for definitions. So public housing, if you don't say it, it's not public housing. And in practice, anyone saying social or affordable housing is absolutely lobbying for more community housing, or actually talking about community housing, or is just an innocent bystander who has read something and doesn't know better. I mean, I had friends come ring me and say, Jack, you would be wrapped in this big housing bill that the government announced a couple of years ago. All that public housing they're building. And I said, no, they're building social housing, and I'm not wrapped, I'm actually shattered. Time's looking good. So let's talk about what's been going on. So the government's been, in terms of policy, we've seen a lot of the housing estates the land being sold off or give away to private developers under the disguise of what they call a real estate model for building more public housing. So example is there's a place in Walker Street in Northcote, 89 units. The founder of Public Housing, Friends of Public Housing Victoria, lives there and lived there for 30 years. And along comes this public housing renewal program idea. And in exchange for building 10% extra public housing dwellings, the developer is allowed to build a number of other dwellings for private sale. not only that, we were shocked when the details started to come out. There were, on this program, there were 22 estates around Melbourne they looked at. These are not towers. These are places that, in many cases, 2-3 stories high. You probably don't even notice them when you drive past them. Communities of public housing, people living there for long times, new people coming in and out. And all of a sudden they had the rug pulled out from under them for the sake of developer profits. So this stuff doesn't happen by accident. This is what got me mad. Someone is, either the government is corrupt or people are just lobbying really well. I think it's people just lobbying really well. It just becomes an easy path out. I don't want to accuse people of corruption, but in the end, it gets bad for us. So here we go. I'll show you when the first free public housing renewal program estates got given contracts. This is what we saw. Okay, so this is called the first tranche of the public housing renewal program. So in Northcote, 87 units. I actually went over there 10%. They actually planned to develop 106 units, and into that same space, they were going to cram in an extra 140 free apartments. And you know, it's a similar story everywhere else. Preston is a broad term. There are actually sort of 3 or 4 mini locations in there that all added up. So basically, the bottom line is for 225 units, they were going to wreck them, throw out the tenants, and we'd get back 329 social housing units. Oh no, yeah, it's no longer public housing. They're going to give it to community housing to manage. And also the total there, 732 private apartments. So this is not even public, this is not any housing, this is the profit housing. So total of 225 units on estates, and they rebuild it with 1,061 units. And this was a shocker. And not only that, but the units that the tenants are coming back to are community housing, which we talked about as different terms, different conditions. So they're not getting back exactly what's coming to. And by the way, this was where I actually initially smelled a rat when I got involved in this whole area of public housing activism, because tenants in these estates were being asked to sign all sorts of agreements. And I could smell they were putting high pressure on them. And what got me was that people it was the Department of Health and Human Services in those days, they were knocking on doors at 8 p.m. at night to get people to sign agreements. And when people say, could you leave the agreement so I'll get someone to look at it, they refused to. And so we got to see those agreements because someone managed to get a photo of one. Now, for this is not like normal behaviour. So poor field representatives of Department of, whatever from the government, they're not corrupt, but someone was putting massive pressure on them. Let's get this stuff all going. And so it's a boss on a boss on a boss. Somewhere up the chain, someone knew what was going on and there was pressure going on. And it's been a heck of a lot of a battle since. And only just the other day, we finally got to hear a bit more about Walker Street. This is the one I mentioned here, Northcote. Oh, by the way, just another thing. I haven't got the numbers for the other estates, but when they redeveloped the 87 units in Northcote into 106 social housing units, we lost 30% of the bedroom numbers because there were 3 and 2 bedroom apartments were being developed into 2 and 1 bedroom apartments. For giving away all that public land, we actually lost bedrooms. It's a fact. It's the Melbourne Age they talked about. So let me just show you what happens in Walker Street. So if you can see my cursor along the right-hand side of the photo, that's High Street, Northcote. At the bottom of the photo is Merry Creek. When they initially built public housing, there was probably rats and all sorts of stuff running around, not very nice. It's very nice now. You can ride your bike along there. And look at the public housing estate. There's 3 to 4 story stuff there going around the quadrangle. There's playing areas for kids. There's open housing. It's a wonderful community. There's people who live there 30 years. They replaced that with 6 housing towers. If you look at the plan on the right, so all the white bit going up and down and a bit across the top, that's all housing towers. The bit along the right-hand side, which faces north High Street, that's where the social housing apartments will be. Surprise, surprise. We still don't know, and this has happened on other estates. They've actually built a fence to distinguish the two areas. The other side, this is, you should see the stuff. It's on, you go on realestate.com, you can have a look at it. You know, it's glass and marble everywhere. And guess what? Priced from $465,000 a unit. That'll be a 1-bedroom place on the ground floor, looking out on Walker Street, up to $3 million. This was called a good deal for public housing. I think I've convinced you that the public housing renewal program is a joke, but it's not a joke that we have people in power who knew this and let it happen. And in the meantime, as I've said, they're building no public housing, and there's a pool of people swimming around at the front of that queue, and they're waiting not 1 or 2 years as they might report on the Victorian Public Tenants Association. There are a lot of people waiting 5 years. They're giving up. They're moving elsewhere. It's a tragedy. And I hope you now get why I get angry. Okay. What else is the government doing? I've talked about a lot of land transfers. You see it every now and then. I subscribe to the Victorian government press releases, which mysteriously stopped coming to me out of the blue. They told me it was an IT error once. I had to go right through everywhere to get it working. You know, they've stopped coming to me again. I'm not suggesting anyone's doing anything in the background. It's just weird. Anyway, public press release just before COVID. The lovely people in the city of Port Phillip donated the car park at the Balaclava railway station to a community housing company called Housing First. No gap between the words housing and first. Notice that their marketing department got clever and grabbed that worldwide name called Housing First as the wonderful process for rehousing homeless. Oh, they were called the Port Phillip Housing Association until a few years ago. They changed their name to Housing First. That's what gets me. These guys, it's not just about good stuff. These guys are pretty ruthless in how they're doing stuff. Anyway, getting back to Balaclava car park. Okay, they give the car park to them. The government donates $22 million to them, and they're going to develop a 46 apartment complex to be run by Housing First, a community housing company. Very nice of City of Port Phillip to be looking after the people higher up the food chain. And this stuff just goes on and on and on and on and on. And we're running out of time for me to be able to do that. I get a bit passionate about it. The federal government has a thing called the National Housing Finance and Investment Corporation. Housing finance, no, go to the website. They finance housing for community housing to build. And they do that by raising bonds and getting institutional investors and overseas investors to invest money in these bonds. In other words, our government is underwriting the loan to the community housing business. You would wonder why, if community housing businesses are struggling like many of them claim, you'd wonder why these investors are putting their money in. And well, the CEO of the National Housing Finance Investment Corporation, he told it nicely. Nathan Dalbon was his name, and he said, "We are really thrilled that community housing is emerging as a new investment asset class." Doesn't sound like public welfare to me. That's why I get mad. So let's get back to the big housing build, which I've referred to a number of times. It was announced in the 2020 budget, $5 billion, 12,000 social housing homes. And Homes Victoria, it's all on the website, but people just don't look, because why would you? I guess if you're someone like me, you do. So I'll show you what they're doing. Hopefully everyone can see that. So there's 4 little sections of the big housing build. First one, $500 odd million in the middle, 500 new social housing properties, 540 new affordable and market homes. Existing properties, next panel, 900 odd million. And there they're looking at working with the private sector to bring forward large developments that they can then buy. Again, social and affordable properties, this time sourced from existing developments. And I guess if there's any builders struggling or wanting to offload something, that'll be good news for them. Not sure how they're going. And then here comes the serious stuff. Third panel, $1.38 billion. And in the writing above, funding projects by the community housing sector. They actually spell it out there. 4,200 community housing homes. And finally, 2.14 billion, by far the biggest sector, partnerships with private and the community housing sector. So this is private developers, even worse, I would suggest, and the community housing sector. So when my friends rang me to say, aren't you excited? As you can see, not really. They did announce a little offshoot to this, $300 million, maybe 400, depending on who you hear from, which is to maintain the existing public housing properties and complete that shocking program called the Public Housing Renewal Program. By the way, it makes me feel good as an activist to know that the government listens. Because when we found out about the the Public Housing Renewal Program producing what it did, and there was an outcry about it. I went to the website of Homes Victoria and they had changed every page. It was now the Social Housing Renewal Program. They're highly cynical, and they've just gone and, someone went to the trouble, or they already had it set up. We go, let's change it from public to social. But at least, heck, I now know they were listening to us. How else is a big housing build going? Well, there's stuff happening in Flemington. There's stuff happening in North Richmond. If you ever go through North Richmond along Elizabeth Street, a lot of people do that off Albert Street if you're heading east to the eastern suburbs. You see those towers, they're in blue. There's 4 of them there. And the big housing build, they're actually going to tarp them up. I think they're calling it refurbish. Not too sure who's going to manage them. Obviously, the tenants will have to move out in the meantime, and then a lot of the open space has been taken up by all that stuff in red, which will be private and community housing developments. So, and that's just another classic big housing build project, just one of the many. And I've got to say, there's been a heck of a lot of public land being given away in this. There seems to be either giving it away or they're doing this sneaky thing called 50-year leases. They did one in Belfield recently with one of the community housing businesses, 50-year lease. So I guess they're getting the land, and there's all sorts of terms and conditions behind this, and how it all returns to a normal use, etc. So won't go into detail, but believe me, there's about 2,000 pockets of public land around Melbourne we've discovered that could be used for public housing. So it's a heck of a lot of stuff there to give us a head start. Okay, so why is this all happening? How has this happened? Let me just say, I think there's a heck of a lot of lobbying. But all industries have their lobbyists. But if I observe it rightly, and this has been said by others, that these guys have basically controlled the debate about public housing, turn it into a debate about social and affordable housing, and basically shut down public housing. There's a lot of report writers, professors, researchers, institutes, foundations, councils. They're all feeding off this lobbying industry. Who's paying them? It's a bit like big tobacco. You always look at who's paying someone, who's paying for the research, who's sponsoring this chair at this university or tertiary institution. You know, have a look at it. And then, so I don't want to name names, but this stuff is going on, and we you know, people don't know about it. They run fancy conferences called the Homelessness and Housing Conference. There was one in Canberra recently. I don't think there was a public housing activist there, but nor would they let us there. I mean, they have their right to exist, but don't hijack the damn conference and housing and homelessness and whatever for your private interests. Call it something else. You make me mad. I mean, not many homeless people get to go that. They probably had some sponsored people they flew up. Talk about lobbying though. There's this. How powerful is this social housing lobby? You may remember in the news, it was in February, I'm just looking it up, the 22nd of February, they announced, the Victorian government announced, they'd do this big press conference, 1.75% of all new developments over 3 dwellings, 1.75% will be levied for social housing development. Obviously, not something that just the government came up with. They would have, you know, they would have had the lobbyists in the back rooms or in their expensive restaurants over lunch or however they network and in the back corridors. So this has come up. There was also an adjacent policy announced that they're also going to exempt social housing, community housing from council rates. The Andrews government doesn't backflip on very publicly announced policies very often, but on the 1st of March, they announced that 1.75% levy was being dropped. I think the developer industry, just the straight out housing developers, have got an even stronger lobby group. What else do? They stigmatise public housing. It's been deliberately run down. There is a maintenance budget for it. They don't come when the tenants ring. They could also refurbish these places, build balconies on them, repaint them. But it's deliberately being run down. Victorian Attorney General's office in 2012 and in 2017 wrote a report damning the government for its lack of maintenance program for public housing. But the government knew why. They didn't want to spend money on this. It was going elsewhere to business people. There's just this general stigmatisation. Public housing people are lazy, they're druggies. You know what the best thing that happened during lockdown for public housing? They did the Flemington Tower surround. Remember, it was all surrounded by police and they locked down the towers in Flemington? Were they druggies or losers? No, there were mums going over the road to do the shopping for their baby. There were people trying to get to work. There were security guards. There were students. Their crime was they're lowly paid, and that's why they're in public housing, and that's why we should be providing it for them. And I think that actually removed a lot of the stigma. It actually gave a face to the public housing tenants with their normal needs and wants. So that's it. Sort of like, all I wanted to talk about is what can you do?
Yeah.
I didn't want to educate you. I wanted to get a message across though.
Oh, I think we've got the message.
Yeah. But the message is only public housing is public housing. And I've given you details on why it's not. Hopefully I've proved it. I've shown you. So beat up those politicians. If you're in a political party, beat them up. And I can guarantee you, they're clever, clever, clever little rascals. They will have a really clever answer back about coexistence and all this stuff. Well, if we want to coexist, well, let's start calling Scotch College community schooling. You know, all those expensive private schools, let's call them community. So we feel better about giving money to them, which we do, public welfare or it's capitalism.